So after we have removed all the trivial functional dependencies, we are now ready to use our functional dependencies to identify the primary key. So there are two steps to identify the primary key. The first is to identify all the candidate keys by looking at the determinants. So we're going to look at all the attributes on the left to determine what might be our primary key. The second step is to determine which candidate key is not functionally dependent on any other candidate key. This will become our primary key. So essentially, anything that is on the left that is not on the right becomes part of our primary key. So looking at this example below, order ID and product ID together would be our primary key. Because if you look at customer ID, you'll see that it is both on the left and the right, whereas order ID and product ID are nowhere on the right. And so we're left with just order ID and product ID, which become our primary key. So given the following functional dependencies that we previously identified, I want you to identify what are the candidate keys and then which attributes would become the primary key. So try this on your own, pause this video, and then come back to compare your answers. All right, welcome back. Okay, so the first one, what are the candidate keys, is easy. That's going to be everything that is on the left. So shipment ID, item ID, ship ID, captain ID, shipment ID, and item ID together. The second question is which attributes would become part of the primary key? Well, if we look at shipment ID, do we see it anywhere on the right side of any of our dependencies? No, so that may become part of it. If we look at item ID, do we see item ID anywhere on the right side? No, so that may also become part of the primary key. If we look at ship ID, do we see it on the right? Yes, we see it on the right of shipment ID. So that is not part of our primary key. If we look at captain ID, do we see it on the right? Yes, we see it on the right of shipment ID and on the right of ship ID. And so captain ID is not part of the primary key. And then shipment ID and item ID together determine quantity. So we've already determined that shipment ID and the item ID are not on the right. So our primary key would become shipment ID and item ID together.